Family and friends, Psalm 34 says this: "The Lord redeems the life of his servants. None of those who take refuge in him will be condemned." This is the truth that we hold on to dearly today. Grace and peace to you from God, who is and who was and who is to come, and from Jesus Christ, who is the faithful witness, the firstborn of the dead, and the ruler of all the kings of the earth. We are gathered together today to praise God and to give thanks for the life of our brother Bill. And if we're honest, we're also here because we grieve. We are missing him, all that he has meant to us. But we also celebrate. We celebrate his life and God's faithfulness to him. And that because of his Savior, Jesus, Bill is now in the very presence of God. So today, let us remember Bill. Let us celebrate his life and hold tightly to our faith in Jesus Christ. Let's stand together and sing "In the Garden."
Well, this morning, as part of the service here today, I've been asked to share some memories of Bill's life. And I can still remember the first few times that Bill and Judy came to church and sat right over there, kind of by Hank and Ann and their little group over there. So every Sunday, that was where they planted themselves. And always faithful in church, always committed to making Nooksack Reformed Church have a good witness in the community, and faithful in all kinds of things. So let me get that out there right away, Judy. Well, Bill VanVleet entered the world on July 31st, 1938, and he departed on January 15, 2021. Bill lived 82 years, and in those years he used his many skills and many talents, not only to make a living for himself and later his family, but used them to enhance the lives of others around them. And Bill, even in his days of youth, was humble and unassuming. He was not a bragger, let me tell you that. He was humble and unassuming, and he rarely spoke of his many accomplishments and his awards. The past couple of months, I had a file about yay thick with all the different kinds of achievements and all the different recognitions that he had received, but he never was one to speak of those. And Shauna was telling me up until a few years ago, she discovered that Bill was a very skilled athlete, a pitcher, and participated in a high school baseball team that took first at state. Now, this was a recent discovery, as I learned, and Woodrow Wilson High School in Long Beach, California, from which Bill graduated, proudly showcased the state champions baseball team in that year. Bill also worked during his high school years part-time, which made him oftentimes tired and prone to sleep in class or two, Judy, as you recall. And it seemed Bill and one of his teachers had a quiet understanding that it was okay because he was going to pass anyway. Well, shortly after his high school graduation, Bill joined the Navy, and he served his country on active duty from 1957 to 1962 aboard the USS Bluegill. Now, submarine was home for Bill and many other Navy personnel at that time. And his responsibilities while with the submarine services entailed operating and maintaining diesel engines, hydraulic and refrigerator equipment on board the submarine. Well, Bill's experience in the Navy, which focused on the operation of diesel engines and their maintenance, prepared him for his first job following the service at the Douglas Oil Refinery in Paramount, California. And his responsibilities were to oversee the production of gas, diesel, and asphalt products at the refinery. And following Bill's employment at the refinery, he took his skills to Los Angeles County and worked as a weights and measure inspector for 1 year before he took up responsibilities with the Bureau of Weights and Measures with the California Department of Food and Agriculture as senior investigator for a 3-year period. It was about the time when I met Bill at the gas station many years ago, and as I was putting in fuel, he had said, he says, I was responsible to make sure that those numbers were correct. Did you know that? And I says, no, and then he told me just briefly some of the story and his reputation here as an inspector, so I got a little nervous when I read that. But anyway, and then in 1971, Bill and Judy's life changed significantly after they owned and operated a 160-acre farm and would later boast 220 dairy animals to the land. They would bring those on and farm. Bill was vice president of the local Dairy Herd Improvement Association and president of the local Holstein Association, and the VanVleet's would earn Farmer of the Year award while on the farm near Rupert, Idaho. And I saw all the documentation. This is true. Beginning in 1986, Bill's ability and skills took him to concentrate his efforts away from farming to work again with the California Department of Food and Agricultural Department, again as supervising special investigator and market enforcement operator. Bill retired in that position in October of 1996. Sometime later, I'm not exactly sure of the year, but Bill and Judy moved here to the Telegraph Road in Everson, just a stone's throw from where Gene and I have lived all these years on the Alm Road, next to Hank and Ann, the Hornstras there. And oftentimes I would call Hank and I would say, well, my field needs to have a mowing here. And so Hank would say, well, Bill and I will run over there when we're on our way back. And he said, we'll take care of it for you. So many times Hank was in the tractor there, and then of course Bill was by his side with his own mower and mowing my field in record time. Well, Bill and Judy began attending Nooksack Valley Reformed Church and indicated that they would like to become members. And I remember John and Inga Wienhauer were part of that same contingent of folks. And so we met at John and Inga's place there at the Clearbrook, and Bill and Judy were there, and we discussed what it meant to be a member of the Nooksack Valley Reformed Church. And anything we said seemed to be okay for these couples, and they both joined later on and were welcomed here into our church community. Well, John and Inga lived, as I said, next to Fran and Arnie Olson there, and later on they became members as well. Well, from my earliest recollections, whenever I was here in church and I would be walking down there to give the benediction from the back, I would be walking down there, and of course Bill and Judy would come out, and he would always say, "Good message, preacher." And he never used my name, but it was always preacher. And even when I had seen him during his homestay under hospice care, he would say, "Well, the preacher's here, the preacher." And I kind of felt like Clint Eastwood on that show, Pale Rider. The preacher came running into town. You remember that show, Deborah? And so anyway, he would say that, and it was always kind of a wonderful, wonderful thing between us. And then over the years, he would give me some literature here and there, and I remember the book on Hawaii, and he talked about Burns. John Burns, was it? Second governor of Hawaii. And he said, "That's my relative." He says, "No kidding." I read the book, and it was quite amazing. So there I got to know a little bit more about Bill's history and ancestry. Well, you know, Bill was faithful in church attendance and always was here promoting to the cause of Christ in this community, in this little place called Nooksack. But he was always faithful to the cause. Bill continued to struggle with health issues following surgery. And of course, Judy was by his side doing what she could to make life very comfortable for him and loving him all the way. And in December of that year, as I said, I had the chance to visit along with Pastor Matt as he did under hospice care. And we talked about God's grace always being there for us at the deepest and darkest moments of life. And we'd always end with a prayer, and we'd always have a brownie or a cup of coffee that Judy would provide for us. And we always knew that, to die in some far-off place, not having here your church family and your loving family would be a very terrible thing. But he had all of those things, and for that we give God thanks. But in these times like these, death claims one of its own, and we reach out to the faith community to find strength and hope through it all. And most certainly we turn to God and we listen to his voice. And the psalmist said it so well, I think, in Psalm 116. He said, "Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints."
Okay, Bill, this one's for you. Well, I'm tired and so weary, but I must toil on till the Lord comes and calls me away. Oh, yes, where the morning is bright and the Lamb is light and the night is as fair as the day. Oh, yes, there will be peace in the valley for me someday. There will be peace in the valley for me. Oh, Lord, I pray there'll be no sadness and no sorrow, my Lordy, no troubles will I see. There will be peace in the valley for me. Oh, yes. There the flowers will be blooming and the grass will be green and the skies will be clear and serene, and the sun ever shines, giving one endless promised me, and no clouds there will ever be seen. There will be peace in the valley for me someday. There will be peace in the valley for me. Oh Lord, I pray there'll be no sadness and no sorrows, my Lordy, no troubles will I see. There will be peace in the valley for me. Oh yes, there the bear will be gentle, and the wolf will be tame, and the lion will lay down by the lamb. Oh yes, and the host from the wild will be led by a child, and I'll be changed from this creature I am. And there will be peace in the valley for me someday. There will be peace in the valley for me. Oh Lord, I pray there'll be no sadness and no sorrow, my Lordy, no troubles will I see. There will be peace, peace in that valley for me. Oh yeah.
As we're here today to celebrate the life, love, and legacy of my dad, when I was trying to think about how can I really express the love that my dad shared with everybody, what came to mind for me was the verse 1 Corinthians 13, verses 4 through 9. We've all heard that at some time in our lives, mostly at weddings. But today, for me, it really represents the type of love my dad shared with everybody. Before I share some stories, I'm just going to read it. And that is, when we see it, and it says, love is patient. Love is kind, doesn't envy, it doesn't boast, it's not proud, it does not dishonor others, it's not self-seeking, it's not easily angered, does not keep records of wrongs, nor does it delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres, but most importantly, love never fails. As an only child, my mom and dad and I spent lots of time together because there weren't siblings to kind of pass things on to. But many things I learned from him over the years. First was, the love is patient. My dad was a very patient man. First with my mom. What many of you don't realize is my dad used to go into Danny's donut shop where my mom worked. My mom had a boyfriend, so my dad kept coming in and asking her out. And she would tell him, I have a boyfriend. Well, that didn't work, so then he'd steal her donuts trying to get her attention. Well, one day, after persisting, so love is persistent and perseveres, he finally persevered. The boyfriend didn't show up to take my mom home. My dad was there, and the rest of the story is history, over 62 years. My dad was very patient having me for a daughter. As many of you know, sometimes that can be kind of challenging when you have a strong-willed child. But my dad always was patient. He had a motto, if it's worth doing right. Well, what that means is, if you hurry up and don't do your chores in the barn the way they're supposed to be, you get to redo them. But he was always patient with me, as he told me I had to go out when it was dark and feed the calves because I didn't show up on time to feed them. I thought he would do them. My dad was a very kind man, whether it was to his employees on the dairy farm, or whether it was when he went back to California and he became a manager working with a staff. Interesting enough, my dad was very comfortable working around women, and his staff generally composed of a lot of women. Well, in those days, when my dad was back in California, they lived probably 30 minutes outside of Sacramento, and sometimes they'd have to leave rather early in the morning. Well, my kind dad volunteered to drive the car, and he would go and pick up all these ladies and take them into Sacramento to work. So before there was an Uber, it was my dad. You heard from Pastor Chuck. My dad had many accomplishments, but a lot of times you never knew about it. He was not someone who boasted, but he was connected. And one instance, when Mount St. Helens blew, and over here there was a lot of ash that ruined a lot of the available alfalfa. My dad was connected, and so when John and David Wienhauer, they came to Idaho, and several of the farmers over here needed hay, my dad was able to reach out to his connections and provide hay here in Whatcom County and also down to Chehalis. That was long before we ever had made a decision to move here. But I think that's when some of the ties and the pull to moving to Whatcom County occurred. My dad also was easy to anger. For most of my life, never saw my father lose his temper, yell at anybody, or even my mom and dad argue. But one story I do remember. I came around the corner in the milk barn, and we had a cow that went down in one of the alleyways, and he was trying to get her up. First time and last time I ever heard my dad say a colorful word. Well, he took his hand and he hit that cow and broke his wrist. And I kept thinking, why didn't you just pick up a stick? But no, he was ingenious. Let's use our hand. As I stand before you today, I owe many of my own accomplishments and who I am today because of my father. He had a very strong work ethic, something that came from my grandfather. When I was growing up, I never understood my dad's dad. I called him Grandpa Red because he was very, had such a dry sense of humor, he just didn't show that cuddly kind of love that my other grandfather did. But what I realized as I grew older is that having that kind of a work ethic and that level of integrity, I look out amongst all of you, and that's why he has the friends that are more like family to him and more like brothers and sisters. The other thing about my dad is he never really complained about anything in life. He lived life with a half-full glass mentality, except for when the milk price was too low and grain prices were high. I think everybody in Rupert knew how my dad felt about that situation. So he always understood when he moved here to Whatcom County, when things would sometimes not be okay with the dairy farmers. My dad had such a soft spot for that. And so one of the greatest joys for him when he retired and moved here was when he got to mow grass with Hank Hornstra. When he used to come to all of the farms and do that, he'd come home and he'd share stories with me, and I could just see that he was again living vicariously through all of you after we had sold our dairy farm. The other thing about my dad that I am so thankful that he shared was how important truth and forgiveness is. When we have that in our lives, my dad always felt that there was no reason to dwell on the negative. He had no tolerance for lying, which sometimes I kind of wondered how the definition was of lying, because he loved to tell a tall tale at the coffee shop, playing dice with friends, or sharing phone calls with John and Hank about how in Idaho, our winters were much worse than the northeasterns you all used to have here, and definitely we had more snow. I also used to hear from some of the farmers when I would be out calling on them when I was in the feed industry, that boy, your dad could sure tell some stories. And I used to ask him, Dad, you're lying to them. No, I'm not. I'm just stretching the truth. Forgiveness. My dad never kept record of any wrongdoings. I'm really thankful for that, because I think sometimes he could have had a long list for me, because definitely if he lived more of a black and white life, I didn't as his daughter. I always thought there was a little bit of a gray area and I could stretch it. But when I did, he would always say to me, what happened yesterday is the past. Don't dwell on it, move on. He never kept scores, and he said the only time I want to know a score or that I refer back to it had to do with the 49ers, his favorite football team. His love was always pure and unconditional. My dad had hope for the future, for his family, friends, their families, and our country. My dad was a man who never stopped believing in the good of others. He wanted us to be happy. One of the last times Dad and I talked, he said to me, "Are you happy?" And I said, "Well, I don't know why you're asking me that." He said, "I just want you to be happy. It's important for me to know you're happy." What exactly does that really mean? He said, "Be contented, fulfilled, never give up hope, and persevere. You will always have challenging paths, but if you never give up and you trust in love and friendship, you will always persevere." The love of my dad will live on in our hearts forever. Let his memory remind us to embrace 1 Corinthians 13 and live a life that matters. I have a couple things that we had a few people that wanted to share, and I'm going to share some of those stories. As I mentioned, my dad was comfortable being around the women. Well, Rolina shared that she loved coffee time after church, because most of the time my dad would go over and sit with the ladies, and they didn't mind that at all. And I'm sure it's because he was telling tall tales, making everybody laugh. And Garrett and Claudette, he loved hearing Claudette sing. And so thank you for singing today, because that was very important to him. And I will tell you, when he heard you the first time you yodeled, he used to tell people who weren't from Whatcom County, "I know a woman, and man, can she yodel." One of the greatest times for my father was the friendships he had with the Wienhauers, the Hornstras, and then through that, he had many other friendships that grew from that. A funny story was my mom and dad's 25th wedding anniversary. What some of you may not know is that my folks, the Wienhauers and the Hornstras, they all celebrated the same numbered anniversary in that same year. So they all were married around the same time, within months of each other. Well, on their 25th, they planned, I would say probably Anne, planned a trip to Europe, a dream for my parents. They never would have done this, but my dad always wanted to go back to Holland to find out about his roots. We were pretty much American Dutch. I knew my last name was Dutch, and I knew growing up, nobody could pronounce it in school. I gave up. I told them, just call me Sean, because nobody could say my last name, until I moved to Linden. Well, Anne shared one of the funny stories, and so I am very thankful I can share this because I can vividly picture this in my mind. They felt the men needed a little culture while they were on that trip. So they were in Vienna, and they decided to take them to a beautiful Vienna waltz production. My dad, being very typical, about 10 minutes into the program said loud enough for all those around to hear, "I don't need any culture in my life. I need a Coors beer in my belly." So they took the guys out before we got thrown out. Another very funny story from that same trip from his strong-willed daughter here. They had landed in Canada, and they were going through customs, and my dad called home. Well, they left me in charge of the farm, and I felt like I could change things if I wanted to. So I fired his milker, and I hired somebody new. So I heard from the group that my dad was going through the airport. He could not understand how his daughter could just go fire that milker. But he praised me because that milker I hired stayed with us until the end. There are many more stories about my father. And I know that they will, from here on out, when you have coffee, when you get together, when you think of them, those memories will come. And I want to thank you all. Your friendships, he treasured them for the life as an adult when we were here. And they made the difference. They made the difference in the end when so many of you came to the house and sat with him and encouraged him and prayed with him. They made the difference for my mom. It helped make things easier. And so from the bottom of my heart, I thank you from my family, and I'm so thankful that you all got to experience the love of my father.
For those of you who don't know me, I am Bill and Judy's youngest granddaughter, Carly. I will call them Nana and Papa, because that's what I call them. But I was asked to speak about Papa's legacy. A lot of memories with him. He was somebody who you could always count on. My mom traveled a lot, and my dad was always working on the business, running the business. And so when my mom had to travel before my brother or I could drive, Nana and Papa would come and stay with us. And it was always fun. We didn't get away with much, though. They kept us on a pretty tight leash. But I do remember I would get up in the morning and Papa would be sitting in the kitchen watching the news, drinking a cup of coffee. And that was one thing that he absolutely loved, coffee. Always coffee with the guys at the roost all the time. He was a man of a routine as well. After church, regardless of what was going on after church, every Sunday we would stop and get the newspaper at the gas station. I remember a few times before they had sold their motorhome, we would be driving it, even if it was just to get it serviced, and I would always ride with him in it. And I would go stand in the middle of the motorhome like that, like I was on a surfboard. And I thought it was just the funniest thing that I would just stand there like I was on a surfboard as he was driving around. Another memory, we were talking about him this morning, Cassie and I, and we were talking about all the times we would go to Beechwood. That was a huge thing in the summer. Beechwood was like Hawaii. I mean, it was so fun to just go and spend time there, but he would always take us there, and then it would be time to go to the pool, and Papa was nowhere to be seen because Papa was up in the adult area and left Nana with the kids in the kid area. So if you needed him, he'd be up there in the hot tub sitting with all the adults. Something I'm very thankful for was that he was able to make it to so many of my basketball games. that was a special memory that I hold, that he was always there in the stands. He was somebody who found the joy in little things. A good cut of prime rib, a good cup of coffee, and a good episode of The Price is Right or The Wheel of Fortune. I loved to sit there with him, and we would try and come up with all the prices on The Price is Right. I remember one time, I even had a notebook, and we would go through them or try and find it on the